Larry, you've got some real thoughts about this healthcare issue and the law. What's your biggest problem with the healthcare plan the way it's been put out?
Well, the biggest problem, I think, is that the law is not coherent. You have to remember that when the bill was passed, it was written in Harry Reid's office at 3 in the morning, just before the Senate broke for Christmas. They had to shepherd everyone in the room. This is the same law that was part of the Louisiana Purchase and the cornhusker kickback. Everyone, when they testified, or gave their speeches on the floor the next day, was saying, you know, I know this isn't a perfect law, but I want to move the process forward. It's going to come back. We're going to go to conference and fix these problems. Problem is, it never went back to conference. Scott Brown won in Massachusetts. They didn't have 60 votes in the Senate. And so this bill that was incoherently written at 2 in the morning is now the law of the land. And as a result, when it comes into force, it is going to cause lots and lots of unintended consequences. Well, you know, the biggest one in my mind, just looking at it as an economist, is the incentives it gives American business to stop covering their own employees and have the employees go on the federal plan. Basically, the deal is this. If the company agrees to pay a $2,000 fine, then the employee can be put on the public system instead of on the private healthcare system. That private healthcare system runs about $6,500 per employee. So here's the deal. I'm paying $6,500 now. I can pay $2,000 to the federal government. The company's $4,500 better off. Let's split it 50-50 with the employee. And the loser from all this is the federal government, federal budget. If you multiply that times 140 million employees, or some fraction thereof, it gets to be pretty bad. McKenzie did a great study last fall and surveyed employers who were providing employees benefits, healthcare benefits. 30% of those who were providing benefits said that they would scale back or eliminate those benefits as a result of this law. When they asked, well, how much have you studied the law? Those who had studied the law the most, 50% of them were going to put their employees on the public system. So, you know, this is a disaster waiting to happen, both for the federal budget and for the way we pay for health care in America.
Yeah, Larry, that's been a concern I've had since I first heard about some of these things. I don't understand why it hasn't been factored in, because some of the public numbers that they've been anticipating is only, what, something like 5 or 6% of employers would actually put people into the public roles?
Right, that's the actual scoring of the bill.
Right.
So if you're scoring the bill at 5% and actually 30% switch, that's a quarter of all the workers in the country. A quarter of 140 million workers is 35 million workers, where we're going to have to be paying $4,500 more per worker. You know, that's real money. That's like what, 140 billion a year, something like that, just in extra budgetary costs from this.
It's extra budgetary costs, and probably also the biggest rollback of everything the labor unions had been working for since the 1940s, right?
Yeah, the losers in this really are going to be American families and American workers who now have health care coverage. Remember, the promise was if you like your health care coverage, you can keep it. Well, no, that's turning out not to be the case. And as we get more and more mandates coming down from Secretary Sebelius, some of which are unpopular, the most recent one had to do with the religious issue, more and more employers are going to simply dump their employees back on the public system. And I think it's going to be bad for the country. What I think the best result here would be for the Supreme Court to take us out of our misery. I mean, what the Supreme Court does best is stop overreach by the government. You know, we're a very diverse country, and the way we stick together and with all of our diversity is we make sure the majority, doesn't run roughshod over sizable minorities. Right now you've got 26 states suing on this issue. You've got every major religious group suing on this issue. This is, the best example I could think of in my lifetime of the government running roughshod.
But do you think Romney has let me just pin you down before we move on to another question. Do you think Romney has a credibility problem, right? I mean, you are a Republican. Do you think he has a credibility problem on this issue?
I think he's going to have to articulate much better the issue of it's okay for a state to do it, but it's not okay for the federal government to do it. You know, that's part of federalism. That's one of the key constitutional principles that allows diversity and allows experimentation in the country. I think he's got to articulate that fact better in order to establish his credibility.
All right, beyond the constitutional issue, which I'm not minimizing, but you as an economist, do you understand the rationale behind the mandate, and economically do you support that concept?
Well, the mandate is necessary in order for the insurance market to work if your idea is you're not going to have these employee pools, which is the way we now do it. Because, you know, if people get the idea, the rationale is if people get to pick and choose whether or not they go on health care, what they're going to do is they're going to, you know, buy health care the month before or the maybe as soon as they get sick.
Right.
That's why, in fact, you know, insurance companies have been picked on the pre-existing conditions issue. But that's what the deal is. If I could buy auto insurance only after I have an accident, the auto insurance market would break down. And in fact, that's the rationale.
And the young would self-insure, essentially, right? The young would not buy insurance.
The young are self-insuring now.
Right.
The young are self-insuring now.
Right.
Now, that said, the real question is going to be here, and again, I hate to get wonky about it, but it's a key constitutional issue, is whether or not the federal government can make us buy something that the private market provides.
Right.
That's really never been done before. And if that happens, I mean, let's just, I live in Washington, and I suppose I should be, I see my house prices go up if this happens. But if the federal government can make each and every one of us buy something that from a private company, the big growth industry is going to be lobbying. Everyone can come to town and get Congress to buy my product. Force them. Secretary Sebelius can force us to buy the product that a private company offers. That's going to completely change the underlying dynamic by which this country works. And I think this is a huge, huge overreach. The reason for federalism, the reason that a state can do it, is if the state makes a serious mistake and tries to do it, folks leave the state. You get to move. In the country, you don't get to move. And that's why we established a federal system, 225 years ago.
Pulling, way up, obviously healthcare is a big part of where we're headed, but, there's a lot of talk about the crisis in capitalism, and I'd just be interested in your perspective on, one, you can reject the premise. Two, the more Republican point of view was we've got to get the government to stop being so gluttonous with resources. There's a Democratic point of view, we need to crank up demand for stimulus. And then there's the fourth alternative, which is we really need to rebuild the foundations. Kind of where do you come out in that spectrum, and what do you think is important to move forward?
Well, I was trained at Harvard, and so I certainly was trained to think like a Keynesian. But that said, I think there's issues with regard to the quality of the spending that we do in this country, and not just the quantity. If we paid people to dig holes and then fill them again with dirt, yes, that would be technically stimulative, at least in the short run, but on the other hand, it would be a pure waste of money. The country would be poorer because the borrowing we would have had to do to dig the holes and fill them wouldn't have produced anything to pay the tax bill in the long run, to pay off the bonds. We need to start focusing on the kind of rate of return we get on government spending. We need to start doing rigorous cost-benefit analysis on the regulatory judgments that the government makes. That's the way a business would operate. Whether they do it in a formal way or not, that's the way a household operates. We should expect the same from the federal government.
I can't get off this idea of the conflict between the constitutionality of the mandate and the economics of the mandate. Can we solve the problem that is solved by a national mandate by creating a mandate at the state level? Does that resolve the economics?
Well, I'm not sure what the problem is that you're mentioning. I think the concern, if I read the proponents of the bill's concern, is that folks who are uninsured end up going to the emergency room and getting cross-subsidized, if that's the right word, by others who use that. That's the rhetoric, the rationale, that the Obama administration uses. The problem is, how big is that issue? The Obama administration estimated that at $42 billion a year. They didn't explain how they got the estimate. If you actually use the same kind of analysis they use on Medicaid, the number isn't $42 billion a year, it's $12 billion a year. That's in a country where we're spending, roughly $2.3 trillion on health care. So we're rearranging a $2+ trillion industry in order to take care of a problem that may be 0.5% of the total industry. That can't be a smart way of proceeding.
Hey Larry, I want to thank you very much for coming on with us, and I think this is an issue we're going to have a lot more questions on. Very quickly before you go, if the Supreme Court knocks down that individual mandate but allows the rest of the plan to go forward, the rest of the law to go forward, is that the worst of both worlds?
Well, yes, we're already in a pretty bad world, and that would make it somewhat worse. But the key here is the word severability. And Congress passes in each law a line that says this law is severable, this law is not severable. But what severability means is if one part of the law is declared unconstitutional, does that invalidate the whole law? They did not make this law severable. So therefore, if they strike down the individual mandate, either the Supreme Court has to strike down the whole law, or they have to kind of scratch their heads and say, well, maybe Congress intended to make it severable. I think that's kind of a stretch. It certainly would be a stretch to us ordinary mortals. I don't know whether it would be one for the Supreme Court. I think it probably would be. Courts don't like to make assumptions about what another branch of government had in its mind when it passed the bill. The law contains no severability clause, and therefore I think if the mandate is struck down, the common sense would say the whole bill has to go.
Larry, thanks for joining us. Come back again. We'll talk more wonky about economics as well, Larry. Thanks very much.
I can't wait. Thanks a lot.